Hello, my name's Mike Higton. I'm Professor of Theology and Ministry in Durham University. And over the last 2 days, I've been involved in hosting a small symposium on theological education and the climate crisis. Though, as part of our discussion, we realised that the name should perhaps have been broader: theological education and the environmental crises, the multiple overlapping environmental crises that we face. Now, I was expecting, I think, that our discussion would largely relate to two things. On the one hand, that there would be some ecological theology, so thinking theologically particularly about creation, perhaps the theology of creation, that we'd have some thinking about that, and that we'd also be thinking about particular ethical choices, ethical decisions that face us as we respond to the environmental crises. That's where I was expecting the weight of our discussion to fall. But actually, most of it fell somewhere slightly differently, in a space between those things in some way. And to my mind, a lot of our discussion ended up focusing on imagination and on feeling, on how the patterns of our imagination and the patterns of our feeling either enable or impede our response to the environmental crises. And so we were thinking about the ways in which the church can be a space which either encourages certain patterns of imagination, or in which certain patterns of imagination are particularly evident, and in which certain patterns of feeling are enabled and processed and responded to. And therefore, we were thinking about theological education as feeding in to that process, both as itself a space where feeling and imagination are encouraged, worked with, and responded to, and as preparing people to minister in contexts where feeling and imagination are encouraged, worked with, and responded to in various ways. So, for instance, we talked about some patterns of imagination. How is it that Christians in our churches, how is it that we are imagining the future? Patterns of imagining the future that God has for us, as it were. We talked about the way in which there are some patterns of imagination, those, for instance, where there's a sort of great deal of certainty about the shape of the future that God has for the church, which can make it very difficult for people to take the environmental crises seriously, to engage with them, not necessarily at a conceptual level, but at an imaginative level. There's an imaginative block that the story of the crises doesn't fit with the pattern of imagination that circulates in some church contexts. On the other hand, we were talking about how we imagine uncertainty, how we imagine a world, what ways of picturing, thinking about, responding to a world of uncertainty where the immediate future, the medium-term future, the long-term future, we face a number of quite scary uncertainties. And we talked about some of the resources that there are in Scripture, language of chaos, for instance, for shaping our imagination in ways which can allow us to acknowledge and to respond to uncertainty without despair, without overwhelming anxiety. And that's partly conceptual work, but it's more a matter of work on our imaginations. Some of what we talked about was imagining how our local lives, the particular lives that we lead with others in some specific place, are entangled with the wider environment, not just, as it were, the ecological environment, but the social and political environment, the planetary entanglement of our ways of living. And thinking about whether we as churches encourage people to imagine their lives in that sort of entangled way, in that holistic way, where our faith, our worship, our prayer are entangled with the ways that we use our possessions, with what we do with our money, with the patterns of land use that we are involved in and our churches are involved in, with our political choices and votes. Do we encourage, are our churches places where imagining life holistically imagining the entanglement of those things is encouraged? Or do we inhabit more fragmentary, compartmentalized patterns of imagination? So patterns of our imagination were one of the themes that, to my mind, kept coming up, but also patterns of feeling. We thought quite a bit, for instance, about climate grief, but also other patterns of feeling that emerge and that shape people's response when they hear about the environmental crises. And we thought about churches and about theological education institutions as spaces that can, at their best, enable a fruitful processing of feeling, of emotion, not just of sort of momentary flickers of emotional response, but those deep affective patterns that shape our ongoing response to the world around us. We thought about the ways in which public liturgy can be a space for processing our feelings in relation to the environmental crises, about the ways in which prophetic symbolic action in public, about the kinds of protest that we might be involved in, and the kinds of symbolic prophetic action that can find their place there, and be part of enabling others around us to acknowledge, to inhabit, to process, and to move through the feelings that they experience in relation to the climate crisis. And that not as a peripheral thing, a sort of fringe thing over against the serious work of thought and action, but as deeply entangled with the ways in which we think about the environmental crises and the ways in which we act in response. Our feelings either impede or underpin the action that we take. They colour and in part direct the thinking that we do. So trying to focus on how theological education can acknowledge and encourage a healthy processing of feeling in relation to the environment. And then there was one last aspect of this that struck me. We talked quite a bit about disagreement, about the ways in which, in order to move forward in ways that will respond to the environmental crises at the kind of scale that response needs to be, we need coalitions of all kinds of people involved in that response. And that means crossing political lines, crossing divisions between people who see and understand and respond to the environmental crises in different ways. We need to build coalitions. And therefore, we're faced with the problem of disagreement, of deep disagreement, and how we move forward in that context. And seeing that those disagreements, as in so many other areas of the church's life, are not just disagreements about the patterns of our thinking and the patterns of our action, but are disagreements at the level of the patterns of our imagination and the patterns of our feeling. And that if we're going to do the work of coalition building, of arguing together, changing one another's minds and moving forward together, that's going to have to involve attending to and working with the imaginative and the emotional dynamics at play. So that's, I think, the biggest thing I took away from the last 2 days, a desire to focus with renewed energy on the patterns of imagination and feeling involved in our response to the environmental crises and the ways in which we can take that seriously in theological education, acknowledge, respond to, and work with those patterns of imagination and feeling.